Good morning, parents. This is our first grade instructional video for the week of May 4th. And this week in math, we are going to be focusing on shapes. So I'm going to be starting out with our two-dimensional shapes, 2D shapes. And those are sometimes the shapes that we think of as flat. Now, the important things that we want the children to learn this week are really the shape names. And I can almost guarantee that circle, rectangle, triangle, square are probably very familiar to your kids just from kindergarten and from preschool. The ones that they may not be so familiar with are rhombus and hexagon, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But this week we definitely want them to be able to identify those shapes. And sometimes we just know the shape, but we don't know how we know it. So that's where we focus on attributes. And those are those things that make a shape a shape. That lets me know, how do I tell a rhombus from a square and a square from a rectangle? So when we look at attributes this week, we really want to look at things like how many corners do we see in our shape and how many sides do we see in our shape. And we really want the kids to be using those terms. What's going to be tough is that at school, we would really be working with these flat shapes and more hands-on. So that may be something that you need to look at bringing into what you're teaching them at home. Some great ways to do that would be to just go around the house on a shape search and see if you can find objects that have that shape. So what we're going to look at is, first of all, what makes a circle a circle? Well, it is the fact that it has no corners and no sides, right? It doesn't have any flat sides. When we look at a triangle, one thing that is sometimes tough for kids is that they are used to seeing a triangle like this, which is an equal-sided triangle and the one tip pointing up. But what we need them to recognize and to realize is that no matter how we turn a triangle, I can flip it upside down, I can turn it right or left, as long as it has 3 sides and 3 corners, it is a triangle. No matter how tall it is, no matter how short it is, no matter how wide it is, if it has 3 sides, 3 corners, it is a triangle. So I really want to look at this rhombus and square. So the thing with a rhombus and a square is, well, what's really the difference, right? I mean, they're almost the same. They have sides that are equal. That's what's important there. And that equal is something that you can flip back to when we were doing number sentences and value. Equal means the same. So when we're looking at a square or a rhombus, all the sides are equal. They're all the same length. But what's different is really kind of hard to put into words, right? Because a square has all right angles. Now, we're not really going to get into that with first grade, so how do you explain that to a first grader? Something you might tell them is, if you walked into a room and the walls were like this, would that be good? And they might say something like, no, they would be leaning. Right. So you just want to kind of explain to them that a square and a rhombus are almost the same thing, but it's how the angle looks. And we know that that is a right angle, but that's a little bit hard for a first grader to put into words. A lot of times we want to call this a kite, right, or a diamond. But when we are talking shapes in first grade, we really want them to focus on using that term rhombus instead of diamond, because that's just not the correct shape name. Now, when we're looking at a square and a rectangle, we can see that those angles are all the same, right? They all have those right angles. But what makes those different? Well, in a square, we talked about that equal word. All of the sides are the same length, right? They have equal length. But when we look at a rectangle, there are 2 short sides and 2 long sides. And some things that we will eventually get into later on is that sometimes we can split a rectangle, right, and create 2 rectangles. Sometimes we can split a square and make 2 rectangles. And those are some things that we're going to get into towards the end of the week. We also want to look at a hexagon. A hexagon has 6 sides and 6 corners. So when you use the terminology, we can kind of say corners or angles for that, but we definitely want them using those words. Now, later on in the week, we are going to get into combining shapes and what can you make with that. So some other things that you can do with your child at home that might be a little bit more fun, bring in some art. You can say, well, what if you used 3 triangles and 1 circle? What could you make with that? And they will come up with some really creative stuff. Like, you know, in the classroom, we would do those kind of projects and they would label all of the shapes that they used and then illustrate, you know, add color and stuff to what they worked on. But those are things that you can do at home as well. So this week, we're just really focusing on those 2D shapes and their attributes. All right. Hey parents, this is our math video for the week of May 4th. And earlier in the week, we worked on 2D shapes. That means they had 2 dimensions. We're also focusing on 3D shapes, which means they have 3 dimensions. This also means that instead of only 2 attributes, our 3D shapes are going to have 3 attributes. So they are going to have those edges, corners, but then also faces. And what's important this week is that we will be focusing on looking at the faces of a 3D shape and going back to what 2D shape face does that 3D shape have. So let me give you an example with the rectangular prism. When we look at a rectangular prism, we're going to have the kids count the edges, which are like those straight lines. We're also going to have them count the corners, which are where 2 of those edges meet. And then when we're looking at the 2D shapes that make this up, we're looking at a rectangular prism has some faces, right, that are rectangles. That's where we get the name rectangular. But it also has some faces that are a square. And what we really want the kids working with this is counting the number of faces, counting the number of edges, and counting the corners, and being able to identify or classify the shapes based on the number of attributes. Now in the classroom, we of course would have all of these shapes. You don't all have that luxury, I know. I actually don't have these at home either. I had to go into school a couple weeks ago and safely and socially distanced grab these. So when we're looking at these, we want to look at things like, does this shape roll? Well, when we're looking at a sphere, which some kids want to call this a ball, make sure they're calling it a sphere. Yes, it rolls, right? It would roll right off the table. And you can relate that back to what shapes do you know or what objects do you know that look like this? Well, a baseball, a basketball, right? And that's what makes them good for throwing and for rolling, because those shapes roll. Why don't you think a baseball is shaped like a cube, right? Well, if we do this, it doesn't roll because what? The faces are flat, there are edges. In a sphere, no, we don't have those same attributes. So what we're really looking at this week, and you can do this by doing, like I said yesterday, looking through your house for objects that resemble this, matching those to the worksheets. For a cylinder, what we want them to know here is, yes, a cylinder rolls, but it doesn't roll in all directions. And it has 2 faces that are what 2D shape? Circles. So when we're looking at things like this, you may find cans in your kitchen that could be used as a cylinder. And what you can do with them, if you have art paper or construction paper, they can use those objects. So if they go and get a can of soup, you can have them put that on paper and trace around and model and show what 2D shape is the face on those 3D shapes. And the 3D shapes that we really are focusing on for this week are sphere. So think, what do you have at home that you could model this with? A cone. Okay, and when we're looking at a cone, of course, it has one circle as one of the faces. And you can test this. Does it roll? Well, kind of, right? It kind of rolls in a circle. Well, why does that happen? Where do you see this? Ice cream cone, right? Cone on the road. That's why it's called a cone. We're also focusing on the rectangular prism and a cube, and you can kind of relate that back to cube. Where have I heard that word? Oh, ice cube. Let's get an ice cube out and look at it, right? It has some of those same attributes. And then also a cylinder. So that's what we're focusing on with the 3D shape. And then again, just like with the 2D shapes, we're also going to look at how can we combine them. Well, you may say when we look at putting together a cone and a sphere, we really could make something that looks like an ice cream cone, right? If I add a second sphere, it will kind of be like a double scoop of ice cream, right? If we look at using a rectangular prism and combining it with a cone, maybe we could make a tall tower. If you have blocks at home, this is the perfect time to get those blocks out and just play with your kids and give them a challenge. Can you use 2 rectangular prisms and 1 cylinder? What can you make? Can you use 1 cylinder and 2 spheres? And maybe they're looking at it like they made a weight, right? Like a muscle weight. So it's so difficult with us not being in school to actually have these things to work with, because this is such a hands-on concept. But you can also use the iReady to kind of go through those shape attributes, and they may be able to see it a little more visually, and really see those 3D attributes that make up the shapes. All right, have a good week.